just a heads up that we are recording today's event. And so, just so that you all know, if you want to remain anonymous in case your video comes up on screen, you can keep your video off and just use your first name. If you want, we have an icebreaker here. What's the best interview advice you've ever gotten? So, feel free to share your name, where you're calling in from, and the answer to the icebreaker question in the chat, just to kind of get to know each other a little bit, as this is, a way for people to understand, to get to know each other as well. So today you are here for Women Who Code New York City lightning talks, interviewing for engineers, and we have 3 great speakers and presentations for you. So we have Kaity Hallman. She's a web engineer at Spotify and also a director for Women Who Code New York City. Kelly Anlis, an engineering manager at Twitter, and also a director for Women Who Code New York City, and Luisa Morales, senior software engineer at Emerson Collective, and a lead for Women Who Code New York City. So you have some great speakers with a lot of experience, particularly in this topic of interviewing. So we hope that you all have some great takeaways. And if you have any questions at any point during today's presentation, feel free to put them in the chat, or send them to me directly if you don't feel comfortable, if you want to be anonymous, right? I can ask them for you on your behalf. And we'll do Q&A after each presentation. So each speaker will talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll do a couple of minutes of Q&A right after. If we don't have time to get to your questions, we'll probably take them aside and maybe try to answer them afterwards, and send them as a follow-up post in email. So today's agenda, I'm going to give a few moments of introduction speech, and then we'll go straight into our lightning talks, starting with Kaity, then Kelly, then Luisa. Please keep yourself on mute. We will probably mute everyone, just so that we can keep things rolling, and we don't get interruptions. But again, feel free to use the chat to connect with each other, connect with us, and ask any questions that you might have. So a little bit about Women Who Code for anybody who is new to our events. Our mission is to inspire women to excel in technology careers. Our vision is a world where diverse women are better represented as engineers and leaders in technology. And we have a strict code of conduct where, Women Who Code is an inclusive community, right? So we don't discriminate on gender, on sexual orientation, ability, any of these other demographics or aspects. And our events are intended to inspire women to excel in technology careers. And so we abide by this code of conduct strongly. So we do not tolerate any harassment. If you do have any incidents or anything during this event or otherwise, please let us know. We also have an incident report form here as well. And before we officially get started, just a quick plug for Women Who Code New York City. So Women Who Code is a global organization, and we are a regional chapter. The next event that the New York City chapter is hosting is our chapter social on March 9th. But there are a ton of events all happening virtually right now around the world that you can check out on the website. And here are just a few ways that you can stay in touch with us. Follow us on Twitter, make sure you're part of our meetup to get updates on new events. And if you would like to speak or submit an event idea, you can email us. We'd love that. So without further ado, we're going to get started. And Kaity is our first speaker. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and take it away, Kaity.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kaity. I don't have slides, so I'm just going to roll with it. So that's all right. Today, I'm going to talk to you about whiteboarding. and what to do when it doesn't work for you. Interviewing for an engineering role without whiteboarding might sound a bit like an oxymoron when you first hear it, but it's possible. Let me explain. First, I just want to define the term whiteboarding. Whiteboarding is a common format for coding interviews where a candidate solves a problem, writing out code, or sometimes diagrams on a whiteboard. It can also be done with pen and paper. In today's world, these problems have gone digital using tools like Lucidchart or Mural. This format is incredibly common. You might have even done it before yourself. But its merits are also well debated. It doesn't typically mimic the environment you would work in your day-to-day. And you're often asked questions that are more like puzzles rather than the problems you'd solve working on a product or a website. Oh yeah, maybe most importantly, it's pretty stressful and nerve-wracking to solve problems this way. Before I go deeper, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. By day, I'm a web engineer at Spotify. I work on a team that focuses on organic growth initiatives through SEO for the Spotify web players. I've been in the industry for a little under 6 years now. But 6 years ago, when I was just starting out, I wasn't a computer science graduate. I didn't have any background in software engineering. I was an art major who went to a liberal arts college. I took one computer science class in school to avoid taking math. They taught me binary numbers, and that's about all I can remember. And I don't even remember that much about that. So back in 2016, I was a somewhat fresh graduate of a coding boot camp, but one that focused more on encouraging graduates to bootstrap a startup rather than to excel as a software engineer. So nothing in my course curriculum prepared me for interviewing at all of any sort. Maybe some career prep focusing on resumes. To be honest, I don't even know if I knew at that time what an algorithm even was. I'm also pretty sure I didn't even know that an array was a data structure. I knew how to code some things. I had a portfolio site mostly filled with projects that I had done in boot camp. I was an expert at leafing through random documentation. I regularly attended tech meetups where I knew about 2 out of 1,000 buzzwords when they were live coding the latest hotness, just going through the screens very quickly. So standing there empty-handed in front of a whiteboard for the first time, I had nothing. I totally blanked. It was a simple question once I knew the answer, which they told me after a few minutes of standing there completely clueless with my face hot. My heart was rattling through my chest. But even then, it didn't mean that I was hopeless. It didn't mean I wasn't cut out for this career, despite what I told myself in that moment and even later on. And if you can believe it, even though I had nothing then, I still got an offer from them. But this isn't all about me. This is about you. And maybe you joined this talk today feeling the same feelings that I did. Maybe you are a computer science graduate, and maybe your boot camp did prepare you for data structures and algorithms and whiteboarding. Maybe you practiced with others, you've read all the books. Maybe you're even good at whiteboarding. This may be controversial, but I'm here to tell you today that you don't have to do whiteboard interviews to get a coding job. You have the power to make that choice. That may come as a surprise, but it's true. Let me dive a little bit deeper. Now, I do have to caveat here, point blank, some companies require whiteboarding. If you decide to embark on an anti-whiteboarding life, some companies will be out of your reach. That's something that you have to be okay with. For myself, I always dreamed of working at a big name company, the FANGs of the world, if you will. I can't speak with certainty, but I feel positive saying that a lot of these companies will want you to whiteboard. They have strongly ingrained processes where they have whiteboarded candidates for years. And I suppose it helps keep the image of prestige to even be asked to interview there, or even more to make it through the potentially grueling rounds. But in reality, there are way more non-FANG large companies than there are FANGs. And the best part, a lot of them don't whiteboard. So you might be wondering, what do they do instead? Well, some companies do pair programming with current employees. Some give you a broken part of a simple application or a script, and they ask you to fix it. Some give you a take-home test that you then explore on site with current employees. I have opinions on take-home tests too, but I don't have time for them today. So we can talk about it later, another time. Some companies sit you down with another engineer to talk about your experiences, past projects that you've worked on, something new that you've learned, how you find out about the ever-changing tech scene. They talk to you about your passion or what really excites you. This may sound idyllic, but they exist. They may not be the Googles and the Netflixes of the world, but that doesn't mean that you won't learn and grow and surprise yourself in so many ways through your work there. So how do you find these companies, you may ask? Well, I have another story. Like I told you, I'm about 6 years into my career as an engineer. Back during my last job hunt, I was around 4 years in. I always told myself that I would make the time in life to sit down and study data structures and algorithms, since I never formally learned of its importance when I was just starting out. I'd take the Udemy courses, finally read Cracking the Coding Interview, finally learn to master medium to hard lead codes. I knew how to capture every edge case in my system design interviews. I would be a whiteboarding master. I would ace every interview. But the fact is, that didn't happen. When you're ready for a new job, or you're graduating from school or boot camp, life is happening. And it takes a lot of time to study for these interviews. On top of having a family, maybe you have kids, you have a pet to take care of, maybe you're working, just balancing yourself alone is hard. And then add practicing for coding interviews on top of that, it's a lot. Like me, maybe you just haven't prioritized practice. But it's time for that job hunt now, whether you know how to whiteboard or not. In my last job search, I did one virtual whiteboarding LeetCode session. I completely bombed it. I had to take a different route. And when I was looking into it, I stumbled upon this awesome resource. Kelly, do you mind sharing the link? So it's called Hiring Without Interviews. It's like a lengthy GitHub README page that lists tons of companies who are hiring people like you without whiteboarding. So with this is your power of choice. You have the choice of what kind of company you want to work for. You can know what kind of interview that you're going to expect because they list out exactly what their process is. It can feel scary and daunting to dive into this world of algorithms, tough coding challenges. It feels like walls that are designed to keep you out of tech in a way. But this resource could be a key that would open the door for you. It did for me quite a few times before I landed where I am now. To be completely honest, in all my interviewing I've done, I've only whiteboarded a handful of times. And 2 of those times I failed miserably. On the flip side, another time was in my interview for Spotify. It was a system design interview. I knew going in that they whiteboarded. So even though I had mostly avoided it in the past, if I were to achieve this dream of mine to work at Spotify, I had to face my fears. So I did study a lot, but I still went in lacking confidence and feeling very unsure of myself. Did I study the right things? Did I study enough? What if they asked me something that I couldn't prepare for? Regardless, I just tried to talk about what I knew, using knowledge from past experiences. And I was honest about what I could and couldn't speak to. I was not sure at all how it was going to turn out, and I left feeling pretty apprehensive. But to my surprise, I got an offer. Whiteboarding can feel like a necessary evil. I really want to be clear that I'm not discouraging you from interviewing for a job where they whiteboard, or really wanting a job where you know it will be part of the process. Sometimes you have to do it to get where you want to achieve the big dreams that you set out for yourself. But it doesn't have to be part of your story if you don't want it to be. I definitely have opinions on the effectiveness of whiteboarding. I can certainly see its benefits, but I wonder, is it the most effective way to measure a candidate? Does it really capture their true abilities? Or can we get the same information from another pattern or process? More and more we see companies trending away from it. It gives me hope for a world without it, a world where we find better ways to test candidates. So you might naturally ask, what are the better ways? Well, I'm not sure I know exactly. It's hard to stray away from the norm. I think we're still learning and experimenting with alternatives and really finding out what works best uniquely for people behind an engineering team. I will say that the companies out there, like on that resource list, doing whiteboard list interviews, they're off to a great start to find the answer to that question. So I'm curious, I want to flip it back to you. What are your ideas? Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Katie. So as a reminder, just put your questions in the chat or send me a DM, and happy to ask for you. And I am going to start with a question that we got. What type of alternatives do you prefer to whiteboarding during the interview process?
That's a great question. I really love the pair programming exercises because you're working on someone with a problem with someone else. So it definitely helps your nerves go down. I mean, I don't know about other people, but I definitely get extremely nervous during interviewing. So when I know that we're like working on this goal, achieving it together, that makes me feel more calm in the moment so that I can really focus on the problem at hand rather than how nervous I am and how much pressure there is. I also mentioned problems where I've been given like a broken app to fix. I found those really fun because it put me right into my domain space that I was familiar with, and I could really just focus in on the problem.
Nice. Another question that came in as a direct message. What are your best suggestions for picking companies to apply to if there isn't name recognition? So if they're not like the FANGs of the world.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say try to find something where you think you would be interested in the work that they're doing. That isn't always easy to do. So I would say the next thing is look for like a healthy engineering culture. One where you can have pair programming, where there is a environment of fostering learning and growth and collaboration across the organization. And definitely one where there is upward mobility, where you can grow with the company in different phases of your career.
Nice. One more question. What would be some projects to include in your portfolio as an entry-level software engineer?
This is a great question. I really like this one. I think myself included, a lot of people might graduate from a boot camp or finish school with a portfolio that might be pretty similar to other people's if you've worked on the same projects. So I would say a great thing to do here is to create a passion project based on the knowledge that you've learned through your schooling with something that you're really interested in. Like it really could be anything, and it doesn't really even have to be a practical product per se, just something that really excites you in life. For instance, I really want to make a project for myself and my husband because we split certain expenses, and it's always such a nightmare figuring out how to do that. So I would love to make an app where we could input the expenses that we want to split and then like somehow include like Vimeo or something like that in the process. Something like that would be really awesome so that it makes you stand out, and then it also shows what you've learned.
Awesome. So I think we're out of time, but I know there is another question here about techniques used to prepare for whiteboarding, but I think maybe that'll come with Luisa's talk later. So we'll kind of move on. But thank you so much, Katie. That was a great talk, and hopefully everyone got a lot out of it.
Thank you.
Great. And now I would like to turn it over to Kelly, who will be talking about virtual interviewing. Go ahead, Kelly.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. All right, let me get this shared. Oh, we should have tested this because now it's not working so well. All right. See, this is what I get for using a slide deck. I should have gone Katie's route. It would have worked out so much better for me.
Are you not able to share?
Yeah, it doesn't look like it's gonna let me. I'm on my work laptop, so I made that mistake.
Do you have a link? You want to send it to me? I can share for you.
Yes, that would work perfectly. And then I'll get started while you're pulling it up. Let me
Yeah.
just send it to you. All right, while she's doing that, I'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Anlis. I use she, her pronouns. I'm sitting at my home office, which has one white wall and one turquoise wall. I'm a white woman with reddish brown hair and wearing a black t-shirt. So I'm going to be talking, Jen, my hero, about developing comfort and poise in your virtual interview. So kind of jumping off of Katie's topic around sort of the specifics of how you decide some of the places you're going to interview, I'm going to talk about some things that have worked for me in terms of really showing up to your interview as the best possible candidate. Can I get the next slide, please? All right, so here's what I think you're going to take away from the next 10 to 15 minutes, however long I end up talking. Firstly, why your poise in an interview matters. So some reasons behind that. Secondly, some things to pay attention to and strategies that you can use. And finally, we'll talk about some ideas for how you can practice the skills that will bring you more confidence in front of the camera for your virtual interviews. All right, next slide. Why Kelly? Why me? Why do I talk about this? So I'm currently an engineering manager at Twitter. I actually last year was an engineering manager at Stash. And when I was interviewing for that job, I also interviewed for a couple of other jobs. Sounds like a great trajectory, right? I'm super excited and grateful to be where I am and to have interviewed into a really great position. But the truth is that, let's call it 2 years ago. And actually, Katie, I think you'll probably remember this. When I was in my previous role, was approached virtually by a recruiter to interview at a FANG company for an engineering manager position. At that point, the virtual interviews were still really new. This was, I think, in like 2019. I think it must have been 2019 or 2020. And long story short, it didn't go well. I was a very qualified candidate and had, I thought, a lot to bring to the table. But when that hiring screen came up, the first round after talking to the recruiter, it just bombed. And now I'm sitting here a few years later with multiple job offers for jobs that are just as good, one of which I'm in now. And that's not an accident, right? Like there are things that changed in between that, I think 2020 interview and how I was showing up to interviews in later years and more recently that has enabled me to really step up and get to a higher level of company. Really exciting. So that's why I'm talking about this. I hope you get something from it. All right, next slide, please. So why is poise important in your interviews? First and foremost, no matter what the part of the interview you're doing, it is always important that you want your future coworkers want you as a coworker. So that is, even if you're doing a whiteboarding, even if you're doing code screens, no matter what you're doing, there is always an opportunity for the individuals interviewing you to reflect on how you show up to the interview. I know for a fact that like these bigger companies, we have rubrics that might have very specific things going on in terms of technology, but they do also always have places for like, if there's any red flags, if there's any green flags, like the behaviors that you're demonstrating and like the language that you're using, the way that you're interacting with your interviewer, even if it's not the primary thing that they're looking for, it can both work in your favor and it can work against you. So while I hope everybody here wouldn't be displaying any red flags, like you can certainly be displaying green flags. And kind of to piggyback off of something Katie said, there are instances, especially earlier in your career, where your technical skills might not necessarily be your strongest selling point because you're new to your job. Also, by the way, those all get much easier once you've been doing, software engineering day in and day out. It gets much easier to pass those coding screens because you have so much more practice. But early on, especially, it's really important that even if you're not able to be the strongest technical candidate, that you're displaying these green flags, like you're open to learning, like you listen carefully, you ask clarifying questions. These are green flags. This is one of the places that poise comes into it, because this confidence in being able to bring a conversation to your level, so to speak. So making sure that you understand what's being asked of you. You feel like you have the space to respond to things. You feel like you have the space to ask questions when necessary. That all comes back to poise. Secondly, probably pretty obviously, it helps you portray confidence in your answers. And that's really important. Confidence and the willingness to be wrong, to learn, to grow, they are not mutually exclusive. Showing up with some confidence, especially virtually, is really important. There's probably a lot of things that you're picking up on how I'm talking, just kind of your reaction. You're like, do I trust her? Does she sound like she knows what she's talking about? Do I want to talk to her more about these things? Like, those are the same questions that will be going through any interviewer's head. And confidence in your answers and just in your ability to show up, again, your poise, are going to be very important to how they evaluate you. And finally, and just kind of summarily, it makes you a stronger interviewee. There's no world in which you're getting every job that you apply to. It just doesn't happen, I promise. But it's always great if you can show up as a really strong interviewee. It makes your life a lot easier down the road, both in terms of building your own confidence, but also in opening doors for you in the future. Next slide, please, Jen. All right, so what are some things to pay attention to? I'm talking a lot about this poise thing. First and foremost, I would say energy levels. So this was something that, going back to that FANG interview that I failed a few years ago, I had done a practice session with a mentor of mine beforehand. And one of the things that she noted to me was that because I was nervous, even in the practice round, I was talking really fast. Because I was getting nervous, what I needed to do before, and I talk faster when I'm nervous, one of the suggestions she had for me was to meditate ahead of time. So kind of take that heart rate that's going a little bit faster and bring it down. Conversely, if you think either in that moment or sort of how you're going to show up to interviews in general is lower energy, find some ways to bring it up. So if maybe I'm going to give a conference talk and I just need some like extra energy that day, I might play some music, like pick something like some like 90s pop, like Backstreet Boys, that will just like really like amp up and like bring me a lot of joy. Listen to some music ahead of time. You could also listen to more calming music. It's all about knowing yourself and kind of how you show up to these interviews, and also being aware of it in the time, right? Like, you're blocking off that 15 minutes before the camera starts rolling. Take a note. Is my heart racing? Like, am I going really fast? Am I shutting down a little bit? What do I need a little bit more of? Talking speed, as I already mentioned, I'm talking a little bit quickly now because I'm giving a lightning talk in an interview. I would try to slow it down even further, especially for my first couple of answers. I know I'm going to speed up. I'm from New Jersey. We talk fast. This is how we get excited. But you do want to start off slowing things down. Another hot tip I'll give you, both as an interviewee and as an interviewer, if the person that you're speaking to is speaking really quickly, you can respond to them by slowing things down. Like, literally answer a question more slowly, ask a question more slowly, kind of set that pace for yourself. If you're the interviewee, you want to make sure you're hearing all the questions completely. You want to make sure you're giving your brain time to process the things that you're being asked. Make it work for you. So you are always in that position where, how you show up, even if you're, no matter which side of it you're on, even if you're the interviewee, the way that you're showing up to that conversation is going to impact how that conversation goes. So you want to influence it. That's a trick. If anyone saw the, from years ago, Stephen Colbert interviewing, what's his name? The kid who played Dear Evan Hansen. You'll see him do this in real time. So another tip for slowing things down, take sips of your water. I do it nonstop, especially when you get to these final virtual interviews that are like 4 and 5 hours long. You're going to be doing a lot of talking. Stop and take some sips of water. Another thing to pay attention to is personality. I put this in earlier as one of my tips for interviewing, which is notice if anything that you've shared has been about you as a person. It's not always easy to do. A lot of times, especially if you're doing like technical interviews, there's really no opportunity to introduce yourself in the way that you want to. But there's little details here and there, right? If they ask you how you're doing, you can answer with something more than just I'm good. A lot of times I'll get like commentary on my background, and I'll use that as an opportunity to say like, oh yeah, like the sign I got was a closing gift from my broker, you know, wasn't sure where I was going to put it right away because it's very colorful. But I ended up throwing it up with that teal wall and now I love it. So notice that you're sharing things about yourself, because this comes back to that question of poise and of confidence. Being a whole person, or at least, you know, an interview version of your whole person is really important, and it definitely makes you more memorable. Another strategy is to take deep breaths, which I'm not doing a good example of right now, as I'm talking quickly because it's a lightning talk. But don't be afraid of silence. This is something we'll come back to when I go to my next slide and talk about a little bit of the practice things, but silence is okay. Taking a deep breath is okay. Deep breaths also help to like calm yourself a little bit. You know, if you take a deep breath, it reduces your heart rate. It's going to help you to speak a little bit slower, speak a little bit more confidently. And unless you know you're taking minutes in between questions, a break here and there is pretty normal to be able to collect your thoughts and come back to whatever you're answering stronger. That applies to both technical interviews and to like top grading or like behavioral, what have you. One other thing to pay attention to, and you can find a million articles about this nowadays, is your background and setup. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. Mine is nice. I like it. It is not an accident. I planned out how I set up my apartment to look like this specifically because I wanted to sort of have some personality and some talking pieces in it. But also just the basics. Make sure you have good lighting. If you don't, look up some articles. There's plenty of YouTube videos about it and such. Next slide, please, Jen. All right, so what are some of these ways that you can have these experiences and get better at them? Because like anything, the only thing that's going to improve it is practice. And as I said, I had a lot of practice. I made some changes to how I was showing up to interviews, and it, again, was the difference between getting to a final virtual interview and getting a job offer. Right? So first is literal practice. There's nothing quite like being across the interview screen from somebody else and answering interview questions. So identify people in your circles that can do this. For me, it was a mentor that I had who I'm very fortunate. She's in a more senior position and had experience interviewing people in roles similar to mine. But it really can be anyone. Anybody who's willing to sit on the other side of the screen and ask you questions and give you the opportunity to answer. If you can, prioritize somebody who's going to actually give you some feedback. You know that it's not everyone. Those people are very valuable. So try to get actionable things. Like I said, I wasn't sharing anything personal in my about me. So then I would start sharing, you know, oh, I play like a lot of softball. I love to read. I've been to, you know, a ridiculous number of operas and musicals, whatever it might be. So get that literal practice, ask someone to help you out. You can find a way to help them out in return. Do some coffee chats. I know we're kind of at the point where everyone's a little burned out from Zoom, and I get it, I am too. But anytime that you're showing up to this screen, it helps a lot. And something I think is true is that a lot of people are nervous in interview settings because they're not sure what questions they're going to be asked and like whether or not they're going to have the answer to them. And the truth is that you never know what all you're going to be asked in an interview or really in any conversation. And the only thing that's going to make you more comfortable being in that position is putting yourself into an uncomfortable position. So meeting up for coffee chats with people where you just, again, strangers, you know, people that you meet either through WWCode. We do some coffee chat matching in our channel, so you can check that out. There's a bunch of other good options. Just like any opportunity to meet new people and kind of have to flex that muscle where you're responding to things in real time will make you better at it long term. Another option is to record yourself answering things. I both love and hate doing this to myself. I'll watch back my like conference talks and I'll be like, oh my gosh, is that what I sound like when I describe this thing? Or wow, like I really speed up when I talk about this thing and then I slow down on something else. It's just one more way to, again, practice being in the position where you're just sitting and talking to a camera like I am right now. And then you can give yourself feedback. Just remember to be kind to yourself. It is only meant to be used for a tool for good, not for a tool to beat yourself over the head with. Another thing that I would say that is really helpful is participating in events like these. We're not going to have any sort of interplay tonight, but we do have a lot of events that allow you to connect with other people or to ask questions in Q&A. Again, it's a great opportunity to be in that slightly uncomfortable space of being able to ask a question, answer a question, what have you, and every bit of practice will help. Finally, if you're in a position where you can host events, one of the things that helped me the most was, if anyone was in WWCode NYC during 2020, you might remember all of the coffee code breaks that I used to host. It really helps. It helps so much. You become so much more comfortable with the unknown, and it's a skill that's going to benefit you both in these interviews, but also in the long term, as you become more and more comfortable with the fact that you just can't anticipate what all questions are going to be asked. You can never anticipate everything that's going to happen, but you'll start to gain confidence that no matter what, you're going to have the right answers. And that's the sort of confidence and poise that's going to give you the passes in those interviews. It's going to elevate you to the top of their sheets when they're looking and saying, who of these people do we want to hire? And hopefully, I believe it will benefit you in the long term as a skill set in general. So that's it for me. Jen, next slide just says Q&A if anyone has any questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelly. Sorry, I'm getting oriented again now that I have stopped sharing screen. Okay, let me see about questions. And as a reminder, feel free to put them in the chat. So somebody asked, how many job applications did you apply to before landing your first role? And also, where can you find mentors if you're transitioning into tech and don't really know anybody?
I don't have a good answer for the first one because my first role, I have a computer science degree and I went to a job fair in my senior year of college and signed my papers for that job in October of that year, which can tell you how good of a student I was for the last semester. So I don't have an answer for you. But Kaity, Luisa, Jen, if you guys want to put your answers in the chat so we can speak to that. So the second one, where can you find mentors if you're transitioning into tech? I would really say, first ask yourself, what do you want a mentor for? I'm going to try to keep this short, but this is sort of one of the topics that I have a lot to say about. Thinking about a mentor, you have to be very clear to yourself of like what it is you want to get out of that relationship. I know a lot of people go into those sort of things being like, oh, I want somebody who can help me like see the path in front of me. And the honest truth is that just doesn't really exist. I had thought for a very long time I was looking for a woman who was more senior than me in tech so that I would kind of see the steps in front of me. I literally have never had one. I'm still at the point where I'm theoretically looking, but think more about what questions you would want them to answer or what feedback you would want them to give you than focusing on just like, I want a mentor in tech. It's much easier once you're already in a company to establish yourself with people that you can learn from. But otherwise, if you have clarity on these questions and these things that you'd want to know and understand more about, they're the questions you can ask like our community. They're the questions that you can, ask to your friends. There's no secret sauce to like what progression in tech looks like. And there's no one person that can just lay it out for you and give you a pathway forward. So that's, I guess my answer is look at the, like, what is it that you're looking to get out of it and identify those questions, identify those asks, and then find the right like communities that can serve those questions.
Nice. We have one more question. Can you speak to some of the red flags you've noticed in your career that new interviewees should make sure to avoid? I thought that was really good.
It's a great question. I do have a couple. Speaking over your interviewer generally not great. I once had somebody doing a whiteboard for me, and I asked them if they thought that there could be a more efficient solution than they came up with, and they just said no. And I was like, that's not a good answer. That is not the kind of confidence we're talking about. So yeah, that level, like overconfidence, like any general, disregard for the person interviewing you. Again, these are red flags, right? Like most people aren't going to do something like this, but they are. The other one I would say is like a red flag is just like a kind of similar to second, like an unwillingness to learn. Or my other favorite is implying that you know more about the thing you're interviewing for than the person interviewing you. I've gotten that one too, and I'm just like, it's a red flag.
Yes, definitely that overconfidence, for sure. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kelly. That was a great talk. And now we will move on to our last speaker of the evening, but a good one as well. Luisa talking about problem solving during a technical interview, which I think a lot of people would be very interested in. So take it away, Luisa.
Thanks, Jen. I am going to try and share my computer, but I'm also on my work computer. So did that work? Can you see my screen? Awesome. Okay.
All good.
So let me go into slideshow. Great. So my talk is probably going to have some overlap with Katie's talk and Kelly's talk. And hopefully this will answer some of the lingering questions that you might have had. So problem solving during a technical interview. Practice makes perfect. So this ties into what Kaity mentioned about doing some practice problems here and there, and what Kelly mentioned about practicing about showing up for your virtual interviews. This is something that's you're probably going to hear over and over again. It's really hard to show up to something and show up to it confidently if you've never experienced it in the past. And so practice is really important. Basically, interviewing is a skill. So practice and exposure to different problems strengthens this skill, like any other skill that you've probably developed throughout the course of your life. The suggestion here is to find a problem-solving method and practice it with every problem you do to form the habit and improve your speed. And so the method that I'm going to suggest in my talk is called UMPIRE, which stands for Understand, Match, Plan, Implement, Review, and Evaluate. And this is actually a method that I learned through an interviewing prep course that I took with CodePath. Towards I think after my final year of my master's program in computer science, I also started off as a career switcher. I studied econ and law in undergrad, taught myself how to code after I graduated, was working in industry for a couple of years, and decided that I was more interested in the backend problems that the company that I worked at was dealing with versus front end, which is what I was doing at that time. So I decided to go back to school and get that education. Part of that was also driven by imposter syndrome, which I experienced for a very long time being in industry. So happy to also chat about that. If anyone is also experiencing that, feel free to ping me. So this method is something that I've used, and it's also something that I now use when evaluating candidates for roles that I'm hiring for as an interviewer. So this is kind of a timeline of what using UMPIRE during an interview could potentially look like. The assumption here is that it's a 30-minute interview. You are doing one technical coding problem, whether on a whiteboard, in a Google Doc, or in some other type of coding environment. The first 5 minutes potentially are just introductions. Ideally, you probably want to keep those intros to less than that so you can maximize the amount of time that you have to code. 20 minutes is allocated towards the actual problem solving portion, and then 5 minutes at the end is for Q&A. So if I'm given a problem, the first step here that I want to do is understand the problem. And this is something that Kelly also mentioned during her presentation. And so you want to understand the problem that you're solving, and you want to understand what the interviewer is looking for. So at this point, you're asking clarifying questions, and it's probably also good to propose your own test cases. These are things like, what happens if I'm given if you're working on a problem that takes in a array as an input, what happens if I'm given an empty input, or if I'm given a string instead of an array? Like, do I need to handle that test case? And these are things that you want to clarify up front, because it'll impact the solution that you then propose. So you probably want to do this for about 5 minutes. Then 2 minutes, really quickly, you're going to do the match phase, or the match step, which is where you're trying to see if this problem matches a problem category. So you're thinking arrays or graphs, or linked lists, and then a strategy for solving that type of problem. And so these are things like utilizing recursion, or a 3-pointer technique. If you haven't heard about that, definitely look it up. There are a bunch of different techniques that you can use to solve these problems. And typically, these techniques are helpful when you want to optimize the potential solution, or find a way to solve it using like less lines of code, for example. So something that's a little bit cleaner. Then after you've done this, you then want to go on to the plan step, which is where you propose a plan for solving the problem, and you walk through a test case and then validate with the interviewer. This is something where, like in Kelly's talk, where she asked the interviewee if there was a way to optimize the code. That might have been something that could have been caught in this step. And usually something like that is an indicator that there is a way to optimize the problem, and the interviewer is basically giving you a hint. And so you want to pay attention to these types of cues, because the interviewer basically wants you to succeed, hopefully. So you have to pay attention to what they're telling you throughout the interview process. So at this phase, you're probably doing something like pseudocode, basically writing out in plain English what your plan is for this algorithm that you're going to write. And then the test case that you use, I recommend using a short input, because if you use too long of an input, it'll take longer. You'll run out of time probably. And so you want to use an input that's maybe like a little unique, to make sure you're catching potential edge cases here and there. And then after your plan step is complete, then this is when you're actually going to start writing code. So this piece will probably take maybe 4 minutes. And you're basically just taking the plan that you've laid out and then recreating that in code. If you're using Python, which is what I used for my latest round of interviews, your code's probably going to match your pseudocode pretty closely. So you can actually speed this process up a little bit. It gets a little bit harder if you're using like Java, because it's very verbose. And so at this point, you implement your solution in the programming language of choice. And then after this point, you're then going to review what you've done. And so here you're going to validate that your algorithm solves the problem. And then you're going to test against additional edge cases or more complex inputs. And basically at this point, where you're aiming to do and kind of like what you're thinking in your head is that you have a bug in your code and you are trying to find that bug. And so it's, if you look at your code through that way, it's very helpful, especially in cases where you don't have syntax highlighting or anything like that. Because sometimes your code could be correct, but it's not actually runnable, which some companies will ding you for in your interview, which is also something that you can clarify with your interviewer when you get started. And then the last bit here is that you're going to evaluate your solution, and you end by providing its space and time complexity. This piece also depends on the company that you're interviewing with, of course. A lot of this is based off of like if you're interviewing with companies that do these types of problems in the first place. So at this point, I put that it's a minute because you've already spent so much time planning and then implementing your solution that you should have a pretty good indication of how much space it's taking up and how much time it's going to take to run. But this is also something that you practice to get better at finding those cues. So just in general, some additional interview prep tips. Basically, another way to make sure that you show up as best as possible to these interviews is to try and study in the same place where you can also then do your interviews. Part of that will help with your nerves, and part of it also helps with recall. There's like science behind it. I don't actually understand it, but it definitely helped me during these interviews because I get very, very nervous. Also, when you're doing these practice problems, I really recommend that you speak out loud. So if you're thinking, you read the problem and then you're like, oh, this seems like it's an array problem. I think I could probably use a temp variable, blah, blah, blah. These are things that you're going to want to do during your actual interview. So if you practice it, you'll get more comfortable just doing it naturally. It's also a skill that comes in very handy now that most of us are also working remote, because sometimes when you're debugging a problem with someone, you also have to speak out loud. So it's just a general skill that's very handy now as well. Another thing is to set a timer. You're only going to have 30 minutes for an interview, potentially 20 minutes to actually solve a problem. So when you start off, it might take you 40 minutes to solve a problem. The more that you practice, the faster you'll get at it. But you don't want to spend 2 hours on one problem, because then you're not using your time as best as possible. So you want to set a timer, think about where you got stuck, and then revisit the problem later on. It'll still be kind of, if you do it, within a week or two, it'll still be fairly fresh in your mind. And chances are that you'll then be able to see other ways for solving that problem as well, which is just a general way of learning. You also want to study under similar interview conditions. So don't use your IDE or code editor and disable autocomplete. You will not have, or it's highly unlikely that you will have autocomplete available during your interview. So you don't want to become dependent on it because you will get tripped up. And if you get tripped up, you'll get more nervous. And then also be kind to yourself. You heard this in previous talks. There is such a thing as studying too much. Taking breaks is actually good for retention and for pattern matching. So make sure you take those breaks because they are very, very important. And then general interview reminders and resources. Approach every interview as an opportunity to develop your technical and interview skills. If you use them as a way to identify areas where you can improve, then you'll always walk away from an interview as a winner. Because you'll always walk away being better than when you walked into the interview. Use your recruiter as a resource. If they don't tell you what you need to expect, you can ask them. And you're also interviewing the company. So make sure you're asking questions that are important to you. It's not just them seeing if you're a good fit for them, it's also you deciding whether they're a good fit for you. And so that also gives you power, right? You can always say no to them and stop the interview process if you don't feel comfortable or if you don't like the interview process, right? So if they do whiteboarding, you can just say, no, never mind, not for me, thanks. And then move on to the next option. And then these are just some links down here for other resources. I'm happy to share the slide deck if anybody wants that, so you can actually access those links afterwards. And that is my talk. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
That's
if
great.
I know how to do that.
There should be a stop share if you hover towards the top of the screen. There should be a button.
Cool. I almost left the meeting, so.
Okay, you can leave it up. That's totally fine too. Thanks so much, Luisa. So as a reminder, ask your questions in the chat. But before we do go to Q&A, just a quick plug to join our Slack for Women Who Code New York City. Kelly just popped the link into the chat. It's a great way to kind of meet other members and kind of get answers to some of the questions that you have. We are all on Slack, Luisa, Kelly, Katie, and myself. And so, go there. And, just a little plug for coffee code break events, which Kelly mentioned earlier, and I think is very appropriate to Luisa's talk as well. It's a great way of problem solving with other people and being able to talk problems out loud and kind of get used to that kind of whiteboarding in front of other people. And so we do have a question. Any advice on what a candidate should do if they completely freeze up during a technical interview, if they have just no idea how to approach the problem?
I can tell you what I've done and what I think is okay if candidates do during interviews with us. Just ask clarifying questions. For me, I don't care if you tell me that you're stuck and you're not really sure where to move ahead with the problem. One of the things, if you don't want the interviewer to know that, is to keep asking questions until something sticks. If you're, spend 5 minutes on it. If you're totally stuck, just tell them you're stuck. That's my advice. Kelly and Katie, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
I'll add that it's perfectly fine to be like, I feel like I'm stuck right now and I want to backtrack. Just say that out loud and then start somewhere where you felt comfortable, or just refresh. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I don't recommend saying I have no idea how to do this and like jump off the Zoom. That's not what you want to do. Which is, yeah, as Katie said, Kelly said, just be honest and try to start off from a point where you felt more comfortable.
Great. I thought the Empire method was really good. I wanted to kind of backtrack to a question somebody asked earlier about perhaps other techniques that you use to prepare for whiteboarding interviews. Maybe it's outside of the problem solving workflow or anything else that you might have as advice.
Is this in general for technical
Yeah, and
problem
preparing
solving?
for whiteboarding interviews.
Yeah, so for me, having a process to follow has been the best one. It helps me keep to time. Two, it's just been really helpful to actually try and debug a problem basically and try and get to a place where I feel like I can solve something. So I think having a method in place is really helpful. I've used Umpire. I think there are a few other ones, but you'll probably notice that they're all very similar. They kind of all start with understanding the problem, proposing a plan, etc. So in that case, I would really recommend Umpire. For other types of problems, I think there's different strategies for like system design and things like that. But yeah, I think just doing practice problems is also really important. Just having the method without actually practicing problems won't get you very far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true. Okay, well, that kind of brings us up back to time. It's now 7:01. Sorry for keeping everyone a minute late, but thank you to our speakers, Luisa, Kelly, Katie, for the great presentations. And thank you all for joining us. As a reminder, join our Slack if you want to share your LinkedIn profile, feel free to kind of connect with each other. And yeah, if you have any questions for us, or if you want to apply to be a speaker at our next lightning talks, reach out. We're all here on Slack, or you can email nyc@womenwhocode.com. All right. Well, thanks everyone.
Bye.